Welcome to another exciting episode of the Andre The Beast Crayton Show. Today, we're going to go into the mind of a beautiful young lady. After going through the pre-interview, I was pretty much speechless. And let me tell you why I was speechless. This young lady has been following my platform for quite some time, and I want to say thank you for that. But out of that platform, her following, she really took interest in the things that I went through, what got me to that beast mindset, the trials, the tribulations, the code of silence or living in silence for so long. She started a podcast of her own, the LFE. I'm not going to say what that means. I'm going to let her tell you what that means. But I thought it was really interesting. You know, the concept, the way that she went about it, and more importantly, what she's getting ready to create for the world. I'd like to welcome to the show all the way from New York, the host, the founder, the creator of the podcast LFE, Lauren Friedman, to the show. How you doing, Lauren?
Good. How are you doing? Thank you so much for having me.
Doing great. You know, such a long bio, all kind of accomplishments. Let's start first with who exactly is Lauren Friedman before we get into the in-depth of your creation here.
Yeah. So I am somebody who just spent the last 20 years almost in advertising and technology. I have a very different perspective than a lot of people in the world especially who look like me. I was raised by two mental health professionals who were practicing. My dad grew up in East New York in the projects on welfare. He was extremely unwell. He was as mentally ill as he was intelligent, and he actually got into Harvard on a dare. He didn't go, but he was able to take himself out of the projects and create a beautiful life for my family and him. My mom also was a first-generation Holocaust survivor. First-generation American. Her mom escaped the Holocaust. And as you can imagine, having parents with both of those backgrounds can create a lot of generational trauma, as you would think about that. So I'm the oldest of their children, and I was born into this family for a purpose. I've always known since I was a little girl that I had a purpose. I didn't know how crazy my story was going to get or how it was going to all unfold, but I knew that I was going to help people with my story, and I was going to make them feel less alone, because I've always felt really alone in my struggles. My dad, actually, because he was so unwell, he actually had multiple suicide attempts throughout my life. And the first one that he had was when I was 5 years old, and I remember it still to this day. And as it turns out, it took me almost 40 years to figure this out, but I've lost and gained over 100 pounds multiple times. In the past 10 years alone, I ended up going from like 3 hours a week of just like a kickboxing boot camp to eventually 14 hours a week of HIIT and CrossFit, to starving myself, to taking 60 laxatives. And as it turns out, all of these physical manifestations that were happening in my body were actually trauma living in my body. But nobody understood the mind-body connection and how trauma impacts your body until very recently. And they really only knew it as it pertains to the battlefield. So what's really interesting is, since I was in therapy, since I was 5, since my dad's first suicide attempt, I'd been in traditional psychotherapy my whole life. I was raised by 2 therapists, and no one saw what was happening because of survival mode. And survival mode is my superpower. And as I've been on this journey, I really understand my soul's mission on this planet. And that's why the Lauren Friedman experience, that's why I exist. And that's why the Lauren Friedman experience is coming to life in many forms, to really help people feel less alone in their struggles, and really bring more awareness to the mind-body connection and how trauma impacts all different facets of your life. And, I'm not a mental health professional. I didn't think that this is the trajectory my life was going to take. I always knew I was going to do something with my story, but I never in my wildest dreams would have imagined that this is how everything was going to unfold. But as it did, I was like, this is it. So I've been spending the past year, since June of 2023, I've been passively building this for years. And I've been spending the past year actively building all of this because I have this sole purpose mental health mission on this earth. And I know that I'm here to help bring awareness to this and help others feel less alone in their struggles, whether they're adults struggling with all of this or children. So that's really my mission. My dad actually planted this seed in my head when I was like around 10. He told me that our souls choose our families before we're born. And something else I didn't share with you, but one of the reasons that survival mode is my superpower is because, as it turns out, I have this insane memory for dates, details, conversations. Like I can't control that I remember every little detail. And I never understood why that was. It never made sense. And as I've been on this healing trauma journey after almost 4 decades of being in survival mode, I learned that the same things that were keeping me alive in survival mode were actually killing me. So that's why the trauma living in my body were killing me, but it also was keeping me alive. And due to hypervigilance, my amygdala, from amygdala activation, my brain has the ability to record all of these things. So I have conversations since I was a little girl that I remember crystal clear. So this has really helped me in, identifying how I was going to move forward. Because I have burned to ashes as a phoenix many times. And I really am, I'm a phoenix, but I'm also I also have the ability to take something really bad and make it into something beautiful. So that's what I'm looking at doing for the world now. And I know that this is my purpose. So he planted this seed when I was under 10 and told me this. And I remember thinking like, wow, his life was so hard. He never met his dad. He was put in an orphanage for the first year. His uncle, who he was living with, was so unwell that he was talking to the cockroaches in their apartment. And then he eventually killed himself in the East River. Like he had this terrible experience on this earth. So I remember thinking like, why would his soul choose that trajectory? But I know now that it was to get me to where I am because I have this ability to connect with all different people all over the world, whether they're young, old, all different races, and I help them feel less alone in their struggles. So that's one of my main purposes here. And at that same time, he told me that he had gone because he was always trying to heal himself. He was very, very, very unwell, very high functioning. He held a job for many, many years, held 2 jobs actually for many years. And he told me that he had gone to a psychic who told him that I was going to be a diplomat. And as it turns out, in my family, I was the diplomat. I was the person that was always running down the stairs at 7 years old, breaking up fights with my parents, and making sure that everyone was at peace. I ended up being that person in my family. In my career, I spent the last 20 years as a sales professional. And what I'm really good at is articulating things in whether it's good news or bad news in a way that makes people feel comfortable. So the real definition of a diplomat is actually someone that has the ability to engage with different sets of people in an effective and sensitive manner. So I'm also positioning myself as the trauma translator, but also diplomacy reimagined.
Okay, so that's a lot of
It's a lot.
a lot. Now I'm gonna get to some questions.
Sure.
You mentioned your mom, Holocaust survivor. You mentioned your
I
dad.
should have said her mom actually was a Holocaust survivor. She was first generation here. I misspoke that. Yes.
So you have 2 parents that are both in the mental health arena, correct?
They're not alive anymore, but yes, they spent their whole lives and professions helping others in mental health.
But it's kind of it's hard to believe that you lived in a household that had these credentials, but they wasn't able to identify within themselves. How were they able to even raise you and your other siblings when you would think when you're in that type of environment they can navigate?
Yeah, so that's the crazy thing. So I was having somatic responses to trauma at under the age of 2. I was throwing up from eating and it never made sense. One of the first things that I remember being told as a child, and this lives in your body now that I've been on my healing trauma journey, I understand this more and more, but it never made sense to me. I couldn't reconcile this at first either. I was like, wait, I was raised by 2 practicing mental health professionals. I'd been in therapy since I was 5, like typical psychotherapy and typical social workers that practice aren't trained in the mind-body connection. They really only started to understand trauma and as it relates to the mind-body connection in 1980. And I was born in 1983. So over the last 40 years, they really have now understood it, to the broad general public. But traditional psychotherapy doesn't take the mind-body connection to account. And traditional doctors don't understand it. And actually, the woman that solved almost 4 decades of survival mode for me was my friend from the gym, and we really bonded over altruism. And she had asked me to help a local family, and this was like December of 2020. And the next week, her father committed suicide, and she's the oldest of 9 children. And it was before she was my physician. It was before she solved this for me. But I knew that when she did solve this for me, when this all came together, this wasn't accidental. This is my soul's purpose, and I'm being led by spirit guides that have committed suicide. I have plenty of instances where I've been able to meet people on a plane, in the middle of, at a pool, in the middle of just walking down the street, and help them feel less alone in their struggles and get them resources. And because I have through hypervigilance, you're always on call. It means a heightened state of alert, which is why my brain is always recording everything to see if I'm safe. So in my household, I never felt safe, but I didn't know it because my body was dysregulated at such a young age. So my baseline for anything was a dysregulated nervous system. And I've actually figured out the universe always shows you things when you're ready. And I've actually figured out one of the reasons why I was dysregulated at such a young age. But that was my same question. I'm like, wait, I don't get it. I've been in therapy my whole life. I've done all of these things. I don't understand why nobody gets it. And now mental health professionals are starting to learn a little bit more about trauma and the mind-body connection. But as it relates to everyday occurrences, no one was able to put that together. I broke my arm 7 times as a kid. I had all of these like screaming things going on that, to an outsider is like, oh, this girl's klutzy, or what's going on in her household. But no one saw what was going on because I also was really good at masking because I was really high functioning. So nobody really understood that trauma takes you out of your body. And my mom told me, like, one of the first things I remember hearing as a child was, you're brilliant, you've been articulate, you're able to connect with adults. Like, my mom lost me in a crowd when I was like 2 years old. And not only did I find myself, but I gave myself my own nickname. And I've been taking care of myself and my entire family since I was a child. But because that's all I ever knew.
Lost you at the age of 2 years old at a mall?
Not in a mall, just in like a playgroup area, like in a room, like a big room. And she couldn't find me, and she was screaming, Lauren, where are you? And I found myself back over to her. And not only did I find myself, but I called myself Lalu, and I was like, Lalu, mama, Lalu. So at that same time that I was told that I'm brilliant and I'm all these things, I'm also being told that I'm a shame to the family because I was throwing up in front of their friends that don't have children, and it was an embarrassment to them. So those things lived inside my body, right? And I didn't know it though, right? I had no idea that this was what was going on, and no one ever saw it because my grades never suffered. I was always hitting every mile mark. I went away to school. I did all of these things. And it's really a result of high functioning complex trauma. And complex trauma is so pervasive and takes part of every part of your life. Like, your background absolutely screams complex trauma. And your abilities to overcome all of this is really a testament to your strength and your inner strength of always knowing that you knew that you had something bigger to do, and you weren't going to let all those like horrific things that happened to you set you back. And that's ultimately what I've always known. Like, as I've been going to market, I've never let any of the things that have occurred. I haven't even told you all the crazy things that have happened in my life, but I've never let any of those things hold me back. I've always had this voice inside my head saying, doesn't matter, just keep pivoting, keep boxing, keep going. Like, if you can't go left, go right. If you can't go up, go down, and you just get it done. And that's part of survival mode. I never thought about it. I just did it. And, while that's incredible, I lived with a 39-year stomach ache and didn't know it until only one day when I went to a 6-day trauma retreat in August of 2022. I felt peace for the first time and safety, and I didn't even realize it. And all of a sudden I was like, wait, I don't have that pain in my stomach that I've had for 39 years. So when you have a pain in your stomach for your whole life, but that's your baseline for living, how do you know when you're hungry or full? I thought pain was hunger up until very recently.
You talked about all of these things that sounds like it was a very traumatic life. Were there ever any moments of enjoyment before, the loss of your parents? I mean, I hear a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. Were
I'm
there ever any
also
moments of happiness in the house? Or more importantly, because there was so much, I don't even want to call it dysfunction.
it
Let's
was dysfunction.
let's just call it not knowing, being aware
No,
of
no,
self.
it's dysfunction. It's actually dysfunction. I have a whole jingle. I'm calling it dysfunction junction. What's your function?
Well,
For
what was the enjoymental time? I mean, because you seem to be learning from your whole life experience as up to now seems to be all fed through trauma. Were there ever any moments of enjoyment?
I was born with a bright smile. I was the entertainer. When you understand complex trauma and you understand the different roles in a dysfunctional family, then you start to understand all of these things. So my family tried their best. My dad worked 2 jobs. My mom busted her ass. I actually was, responsible for cleaning, like helping them out. I was the other parent. I was their co-parent. I filled in for the gaps when either parent couldn't do it. Even, taking care of my sibling, who I eventually did have to take legal action against a few years ago after my mom's death. So that is something that was really hard. But we did have fun. My mom did try her best to give us as many exposures to culture and things that they could. They didn't have a lot of money. They gave us everything they could. They never bought anything for themselves. They raised us with really good values, always helping others, even at the expense of your own self. But yeah, I've always been full of joy and love. And most people who have been through this much trauma, and by the way, I didn't know it was trauma. I knew things were bad, right? But that was the only thing I ever knew. So I never knew anything else. And so when you ask a question like, was it their fun? Yeah, I don't know what normal families do. That's like the hallmark of being an adult child of a dysfunctional family. It used to be actually called adult children of alcoholics, but now they brought in the definition to dysfunctional families, meaning any type of mental illness, substance abuse, addiction, anything like that, living in a family that disrupts your ability to grow and individualize as a person. So I never considered myself, full of trauma until the last 2 years when I had to be treated for survival mode. And just so you know, the reason why this happened, why I had to be treated was my body ended up like, this is enough. And I was in adrenal fatigue, which isn't technically like an actual diagnosis that's recognized by medical professionals generally. At one point, they thought I had a tumor on my adrenal gland. And when they didn't, they were like, just lose more weight, get to a better BMI. And I'm like, but I already lost over 115 pounds. It doesn't make sense. And I've always eaten right. I've always worked out. Like none of those things made sense. So when you talk about fun, yeah, I always have fun. Like I am the epitome of fun. That's why I love children and children love me. I'm an adult child. I look at things through the lens of a 5-year-old. I hang out at the pool with, I have 4-year-old best friends. So I'm always having fun despite my circumstances. That's why nobody knew what was going on in my household, because I always made it my mission to enjoy my life anyway and to keep moving forward. But unless you process that, like you could talk about it. I've always spoken about it outwardly, like 10 years ago. This is a perfect example. And this is actually last Sunday was 10 years since Robin Williams committed suicide. Right. And my dad actually had been estranged for 9 years prior to his suicide in 2014. And because I was really close with him, but I had to eventually separate myself from this. So when Robin Williams committed suicide, that's when I was able to publicly share on social media what had gone on. Because I was like, I'm like not a hypocrite. So I wouldn't share what was going on. I had a very complicated relationship with his death because I always knew that was the only way he was going to ever be at peace. It was very clear to me at a young age that he was never going to be at peace unless he killed himself, which is a really horrible way to live. So when you think about hypervigilance, you're always expecting something terrible to happen, even if you're having fun, even if you're out with your friends, even if you're high accomplished professional. I always was expecting the other shoe to drop because it always did. And when you learn how to get your body out of hypervigilance, you then really enjoy your life. So now that I've been out of hypervigilance and got my body out of survival mode, I now really understand what it is to enjoy things. But to your original point, I'm the entertainer. Like Billy Joel says, the idol of my age. I've always been, I can make a joke anywhere and everyone laughs. I actually started doing comedy last summer. I'm bringing a little bit of that into my work. A lot of things with educating about mental health through music. Music is a big component of what I've been able to do to help regulate my nervous system and heal and communicate and share about how do you teach about how do you educate to people that have no idea what this means, like to have complex trauma, to have all of these situations that live on top of each other. So yeah, my family did have fun, not in the traditional ways. They didn't have a lot of money. I said to my therapist the other night, I was like, I don't know what normal families do for fun, but my family went to family therapy for fun. So
How long
that
did
was
it
like
take you? How long did it take you to get diagnosed or to recognize what you were going through? Who labeled the hypersensitive tagline to what you was going through?
Yeah, so it took me 39 years. Well, it's really 38 years. I was diagnosed with adrenal fatigue as well as complex PTSD in December of 2021. But prior to that, this was like since December of 20, or no, since June of 2020, I had been feeling off and I started to gain all this weight, and even my like eyebrows got really dark. My skin started like looking so weird. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't sleep. I was working out 14 hours a week, but I was gaining weight and it made me crazy. I gained 61 pounds, and that's from this hormone dysfunction that's attributed to lifelong survival mode and complex trauma. So when my doctor, my integrative physician, she's a medical MD, she understands the hormone mind-body connection. She was the one that first diagnosed me. So that impacted my thyroid, actually. So thyroid medicine was the first thing that I got on. I'm not on any psychiatric medicine, which I'm very grateful for. I really believe it, has a place in people's lives when they need it. But I don't need it personally at this point. But I was terrified because in the summer of 21, I had lost my job for the 5th time, even though I was a top producer at my company, and they got rid of my role. And that just sent me into, I was already having a lot of mind-body issues and didn't really realize it. But after that, I started having flashbacks and I was wetting the bed and my brain wasn't working. And I was interviewing at Amazon and Google and all of these big companies that I've always worked at, and I couldn't think straight. So when you look at everything
What do you mean,
holistically,
Lauren? You couldn't think straight. What share it with the
I
viewers?
was,
What do you mean you
I
couldn't
didn't have any, I'm sorry.
explain to the viewers what do you mean you couldn't think straight? Because
Yeah.
you had 5 jobs. You lost 5 high-powered jobs. I mean, what were the people thinking that what were you doing that was exhibiting them either letting
No,
you go or you quitting?
it wasn't. So it's actually had nothing to do with me. These were after M&A and divestitures as part of the advertising technology community. So they were whole companies, whole teams were laid off, not just me. So it wasn't because of me not being able to think straight or anything. Actually, the reason why nobody realized this was because I was so successful and I was so high functioning, and no one knew. It's the hallmark of living in high functioning survival mode. But in 2021, I had closed a really big deal with a major pharmaceutical brand. And again, I was functioning great at work, but after this last job, it just disrupted my nervous system, and I already wasn't feeling well to begin with. And I didn't really understand it because I was like terrified, because mental illness doesn't normally present itself in your mid 30s or your late 30s. So I was like, what's going on? And I was having I've never had anxiety in my life. I didn't know I had anxiety because everybody around me had so much anxiety that anything I felt, I just let go. But my brain wasn't working when I was interviewing, and like to the point where I would lose words. I couldn't have this conversation with you. Amazon was like, why do you want to work here? Now I was at the 4th round interview. Like I was already deep in. I'd been doing well up until this point, but then one day my brain just didn't work. And they're like, why do you want to work here? And I was like, and normally I would talk about data because that was part of my background, or anything with cookie deprecation, which is another thing that's a big thing in my industry. And I didn't say any of that. I just said, because I shop on Amazon. Like that's how my brain wasn't working. So I couldn't even get off the sofa. I was having trouble driving, and I've never actually had an actual accident. I've had like unfortunate car situations where my brakes broke on the turnpike, but I never had an accident while I was like at a high speed. My steering mechanism broke, but I got right back on immediately. So I've exhibited all of these different signs of having like a PTSD episode, but because I had never had this before and nobody had diagnosed me with this in my whole life, I was terrified. So when my doctor figured this out, we started with thyroid treatment. And then I eventually my body wasn't responding to the Ozempics of the world. I actually gained weight on it. And it took me 13 months after starting EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And it actually helps you reprocess traumatic events, and actually it helps you still remember them, but it has a less of a trigger in your body and in your mind. And I have a really amazing examples of how it's basically magic. Like, I've done psychotherapy my whole life, but EMDR is amazing. So I started that. I had to go to a trauma retreat because I was full of rage. I had the most amount of rage. I was so angry at everyone. I didn't tell you this, but my husband's family also has been siphoning money in their family business for the last 20 years because they got into financial trouble. And instead of taking it upon themselves to take care of it, they decided to make it my problem and my husband's problem. So it destroyed our marriage, and we're best friends. He's actually very much supporting this, but I held all their shame inside me. So I held my family's shame. I held everybody's shame inside me, the failures of my organizations that now when I'm interviewing, they're like, what's wrong with you? Why did you lose your job so much? And I'm like, there's whole companies that closed. I've had former coworkers commit suicide. Like, this is a serious problem in my industry. So I have a lot of solutions, whether it's B2B, B2C, or for children, to help solve for complex trauma and help people really understand why they're reacting to a specific situation in this way, and how they could really, get to a better place of peace. That's like, I didn't even know, I've never met anybody who was healing before in my life, despite being surrounded by mental health professionals. And if I had met somebody who had even been on a healing journey in my entire life, who had been through something that I had been through, even remotely close to that, it would have changed everything. So when I went to my healing trauma retreat in August of 2022, and I met people who were like me for the first time, who had similar things happen, who had, like, I have trouble writing, but it never affected my schoolwork. I was in honors classes. I was in AP. I always did really well. So no one cared. No one knew it. I wasn't, they didn't catch this. I just, like, slipped under the radar. And my sibling is also very, very high functioning. That person has a very high powered job. And my dad also functioned for a really long time. So when you grow up in that level of dysfunction, it is dysfunction. It's so pervasive, and it takes over everything that you don't know. Something's not right. Like, shit ain't right, but you don't even know how unright it is, how wrong it is, until you know. And once you know this, you can't unsee it. And trauma seeps into every part of your life. And I have so many instances of this. So between my family, my career, even though I was really good at my job, I was really successful. Everyone's like, I can't believe you're not going to go back to the industry, and you're so good at it. You're so passionate at it. I've been able to do all of these things and then having my in-laws, all of that in my marriage, while trying to figure out what's going on with my body. And it was like playing like a game of whack-a-mole. So that's basically what I've been doing my whole life. And now that I've been able to find peace and be able to heal my healing trauma, it took me a really long time to get my body to this place and my mind. Now I'm so hell-bent on keeping my peace, but also helping others find their peace.
Let's talk about that real quick. I like your slogan where you say, how are you healing?
Yeah.
And let's go to two parts. Let's talk about that. And then let's also talk about when you talked about only music can save us. Give us a quick breakdown of those two things in your life.
So I was going to market originally with a different brand that nobody really understood. It was called I Run a Tight Shipwreck, and I'm still going to use it. People thought it was funny. Could like the phrase I run a tight ship, but it was a shipwreck. Because like you said, how did you get diagnosed? Like, how did nobody see this? Especially given my background. That's what the crazy thing is. That's why I know that I am meant to do this. Like, nobody else in this entire world has this story. Nobody else has this background. My dad also, like, he grew up in East New York in the projects. He was the only white kid in his neighborhood. So he had me growing up thinking, like, we would pass by projects growing up and he'd be like, don't be afraid of the black man, be afraid of the white man. He's like, the society's trying to hold the black man down. He's like, it's not their fault they're living like this, but he's like, the white men, they're dangerous. So I grew up like in a very different perspective. So as I've been building all of this, I've always felt my dad's presence over the years. Like, and music was a way that he was able to communicate with me and share his own struggles. Like during Kurt Cobain's suicide, that was kind of how he originally shared with me about his, even though it wasn't a direct conversation until like maybe 2 years later. So he's always been able to communicate with me through music. And that's how he shared some of his struggles with his own mental health and all these different ways that I know I can help others understand. So that's the only music can save us. There's going to be either, I'm not sure if it's going to be a
Pearl
movie
Jam.
or a series, but I use music to not only educate, but also help find connection, but also regulate my nervous system. I found ways to leverage different music to make sure that I'm not going to go out in beast mode and punch somebody, not that I ever did,
What's
but
the connection with Pearl Jam?
Pearl Jam. So Pearl Jam in 2012, I never was like I liked alternative music growing up. And in 2012, there was a book that I was reading. I've been a voracious reader my whole life. And there was a book that I was reading that had a Pearl Jam song in it. And just one day, suddenly it just clicked. And Pearl Jam really helped me through a lot of hard times before I was on this journey. And as I was thinking, when I went to I have a few different reasons for why I'm starting my pediatric complex trauma foundation, as I get this all stood up. But one of the reasons was I have a few friends that their children had been struggling with things. And in the days leading up to me going to my trauma retreat in August of 22, something had gone on with one of my close friends and their family. And I remember saying, like, I've been involved in a pediatric cancer foundation for the last 10 plus years. So I remember saying to them, I'm going to start a pediatric complex trauma foundation. And when I got to and that was like on a Sunday, and I went to my trauma retreat that Thursday. And when I came back, I knew exactly what I was going to do, because I never, when I met people that were like me, that had similar things like me, that had similar physical responses, that were, I was told my whole life that these are your fault, there's something wrong with you by society. Like, I was told in my industry that I didn't have the right look because I was too fat, or all of these things. But as soon as I lost weight, my career skyrocketed. And I was able to use my weight loss story to explain really complicated data to a variety of audiences, that, a variety of like levels of understanding, right, of data, through my weight loss journey, and talking about fidelity and quality of data. And I have the ability to basically make really complicated things more palatable. So when I got back from my trauma retreat, I knew I was going to do this. I was still employed at my last company, but I knew this was my mission. Like, I was going to stand this up. And I wanted, children who are in this situation when, you have all these things that are happening and you can't talk about it at school. Like, I couldn't talk about when I was being awoken with my dad setting off a fire alarm at 2 a.m. and I was the one who like solved it, and all these things. I had to go to school the next day and my nervous system was lit up, and you can't talk about that. And I just went on with my life. But I knew I was going to do something with that. So as I was figuring out what the name of it was going to be, music speaks to me and it heals my soul. And there's a song called Why Go by Pearl Jam. And the line is, maybe someday another child won't feel as alone. And that's the tagline. So it's going to be called the Why Go Foundation. And the tagline is, maybe someday another child won't feel as alone. And I actually have a few people that are going to introduce me to Eddie and the band, because I need their approval to use this. And I know that he will totally sign on to this, because they have their EB Foundation, which is also committed to helping children with a rare skin disorder. And this just fits in perfectly with his background and their mission of their band. But there's a lot of different ways that music has really made me feel less alone. And I know that through this organization, I could help children who are dealing with a variety of issues meet people like themselves. Because if I had met people like me when I was a child, I wouldn't have let all of these things occur. I would have figured this out sooner, and I would have felt less alone, and I could have had more people to depend on, because I still feel very alone to this day. But I'm creating communities so that others don't feel as alone. And I also have my people as well. But to your original point was,
Man, you have a tremendous story, tremendous information. I'm glad you took the time to come and share all of this on our platform. Anytime we can do something to further spread your message, we're here to do that. How can the viewers reach out to you for your services, and how can they follow you on your new platform? Before we leave, two parts of the question. The first question is, what kind of people need to reach out to you? And then the ending of this question is, how do you stay in that beast mindset to keep with all you've been dealing with this for 40 years?
Yeah.
40 years. How do you stay in that beast mindset? Those are the two questions before we wrap up. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been LFE, Lauren Freeman Experience, on another exciting episode of the Andre the Beast Crayton Show.